Lecture 8, Part 2. After we finished Lecture 8, Part 1, to determine the multiplier effect of fiscal policy, now we will analyze the next effect of this policy, that is, the crowding out effect. In this section, we need to expand the investment function with the effect of interest rate, not only the predetermined part. So we see that when we analyze investment, we have the assumption that for the first step, we will ignore the effect of interest rate. And in the second step, we will analyze the more effect of interest rate. So now, if we have the changes in the interest rate, so how is the effect of fiscal policy? The interest rate is determined from the monetary policy. So now, in order to analyze the fiscal policy, we will mention the two more diagrams. The first diagram is the money market to determine interest rate. And second is the effect of interest rate on investment. And this is the equation for investment. So we can see that in this equation, we use real interest rate, little r. But in the diagram, we show the little I means nominal interest rate. So what is the difference between the two interest rates? The real interest rate and nominal interest rate is different by the inflation rate. But for this chapter or this lecture, we have the assumption that the constant price, so the inflation rate is 0. And we have the same value for real interest rate and nominal interest rate. It's just the same. So now, if we have, for example, the increase in, firstly, the increase in government spending, so it will affect predetermined expenditure. This change is already explained from the previous section, part 1, when we say that when we increase the government spending or tax for this policy, the first change is the change in aggregate expenditure, the predetermined aggregate expenditure. So, in the model, we won't have higher value for aggregate expenditure and the aggregate expenditure shift upward. So the new equilibrium won't be here. And output or aggregate expenditure at equilibrium increase m times higher than the first change in predetermined expenditure. And this explains the first change in aggregate demand. This is called multiplier effect. So now, if we mention the money market, so what happened to the money market? Because after the multiplier effect, aggregate expenditure and aggregate demand increase very much. So the increase in expenditure require more money. So it will affect the demand for money. Demand for money increase and shift upward. And if the central bank doesn't print more money, the stock of money in the economy is the same, so there won't be the shortage of money this distance, and the shortage of money will force increase in the interest rate. With the higher interest rate, firms have to pay more when they borrow money for investment, so they won't reduce their investment, and the reduction in investment lead to the reduction in aggregate expenditure and aggregate demand. So this reduction is called the crowding out effect. So now finally, we can see that there are two effects of fiscal policy. The first effect, multiplier effect, increased aggregate expenditure from the blue line to the red line. Blue line to red line. But crowding out effect reduced the aggregate expenditure and aggregate demand to the yellow line. So the final effectiveness of the policy is the distance between the blue and yellow line. And it means that the effectiveness of the policy reduced and lower than the multiplier effect. To see the relation between the two effects, so we can say that if we increase government spending by $20 billion, so firstly, the first change in aggregate demand is 20 billion. And so multiplier effect will make aggregate demand increase more by this distance. And now, if there is crowding out effect, so AD will reduce backward, maybe to this line by this level, maybe more or maybe less. It depends on the effect or the effectiveness of the two effects. If the multiplier effect is higher than crowding out effect, so crowding out will be smaller, and the final result for AD may be at this point. But if the multiplier effect is smaller than crowding out effect, so the crowding out effect is so strong, and it will reduce AD more than this point, and even to this point or even lower, because the crowding out effect is too strong and much higher than the multiplier effect. So this is the result for fiscal policy. And now we examine the effect of monetary policy. In fact, the explanation for monetary policy is partly explained in lecture 3, monetary system, when we say that the central bank may use the 3 operations to change the money stock of the economy, and this change is called monetary policy. If the central bank use this operation to increase the money stock, so we call this is the expansionary monetary policy, or if the money stock reduced, this is the contractionary monetary policy. So now, when we look at the transmission like this, with the 4 diagram, we will see the effect of monetary policy on GDP, the last diagram. Okay? The first diagram shows the money market with money supply and money demand. Second diagram shows the relation between interest rate and investment. The third diagram is the Keynesian model to examine the equilibrium point. And the last one shows the aggregate demand at the constant price. So now, initially, we have the initial interest rate, initial equilibrium, and initial AD. So if we have, for example, expansionary monetary policy, money supply increase and shift to the right, this will lead to the reduction in the interest rate. And so, the lower interest rate will encourage investment, and investment increase. It will lead to the increase in expenditure, and finally, the increase in aggregate demand. So now we can say that the result for the monetary policy is the increase in aggregate demand. And if the price is constant, GDP will increase very much from Y1 to Y2. But if the aggregate supply is not this one, it's upward sloping, and it requires the increase in the price to satisfy the increase in aggregate demand. So we won't have the new equilibrium. It means that the price will increase and GDP increase from Y1 to Y0. Not this much. Not so much to Y2. So this is the result for this policy. And now, from this explanation, we may have some suggestion for the combination between the two policy, fiscal policy and monetary policy. This will be part 3 of this lecture. So this is the end of part 2, lecture 8.